Hello and welcome to Skills and Automation. My name is Ash and today we're going to go through another session on useful code where we look at code snippets to tackle real life scenarios. In this specific video, we will learn how to use the SQL Group By clause in VBA. Now, this may seem like a random video about a very specific topic, but I assure you it's not. We will cover the broader topic of how to use Excel like a database, how to use ADO or ActiveX Data Objects to connect to the Excel application, how to use SQL in Excel, how to aggregate multiple columns of data quickly and efficiently using Group By, how to sum data after aggregating it. So in addition to the Group By clause, hopefully this video will open more possibilities for you to add to your coding arsenal. For example, you could use the same technique to extract data out of MS Access or SQL Server by making a few modifications. Before we move further, let's briefly look at the layout of this video so that you are aware of what's coming. We will start with a demo on the application of the Group By clause. Then we will build the code. The coding part is divided into 4 sections. In the first section, we will set up the connections, run the Group By statement, and paste the results into an Excel sheet. This section by itself will cover the entire code to perform the operation we see in the demo. The rest of the sections are for additional learning. The second section is geared towards those of you who are not familiar with SQL. Here we will gradually build the SQL Group By query. Watch this if you want a quick intro to SQL. The third section will look at some error handling. Always good to include that. Up till now, we are dumping the results straight into the worksheet. In section 4, we will look at how to transfer the query results into an array. All the code covered in this video will be posted to our website. You can find the link in the description below. Okay, great. Let's move on to the demo. Let's have a look at the data. Here, we have line level information for customer invoices. You can see that the first invoice has 3 lines of data. This is how data is stored in databases as well, that is on a granular level. What we want to do is aggregate or group this data into a single line per invoice where we can see the totals of the invoice amount, tax amount, and gross amount for each invoice. We would also like to see some more common information for that invoice, such as invoice date and customer name. This is your typical header level data. In our example, we want to display the results on the invoice header worksheet, which is currently blank. Okay, let's open the VB editor, Alt F11. We have a full code here, which we'll be building later on. Let's run this. Let's go to the header worksheet. There, we can see single lines for each invoice and various totals are visible as well. Let's move on to the coding part and check out how we can build this code. In this section, we'll look at how to create a basic procedure where we'll group the data as per the requirements. Okay, so what is the plan here? The grouping of the data is going to be done using an SQL query, but we can't just straight up write an SQL query in VBA. That's the first constraint. Next, I know and you know that the data is stored in our invoice details worksheet, but our SQL query won't be able to directly reference it the same way we do it in VBA. For us to achieve this, we will need to recognize Excel as a database, connect to it, and only then can we fire off our SQL query. And in order to do this, we will need to be able to access some methods and properties that are only available in an external library called the ActiveX Object library. Let's create a reference for that. Come to Tools, References. Let's scroll down till we see Microsoft and then search for ActiveX Data Object library. It's this one right here. Select the latest version that you have. Click OK. Let's create a sub procedure. Since this is the basic form with no fringe code such as error handling, we'll just call it vanilla. Let's move to the next step. Since we have added a reference to the ActiveX library, we can now go ahead and create a new connection. Let's stem a connection variable. we'll use the ADODB library and choose connection. Next, we'll set it to a new connection. The next step would be to open the connection that we've just created. So we can go con.open. It's asking for connection string. But what is that exactly? A connection string is going to allow us to establish a connection with our data source. In the connection string, we will need to specify what we want to connect to and how we want to connect to it. Building the connection string from scratch is pretty tough, and I wouldn't recommend it. Thankfully, we have a wonderful resource online, connectionstrings.com. Go to your search engine, type connection strings. It'll probably be the first result. Let's click this. On the main page, we'll search for Excel, but let's pause here for a second. If you want to connect to an SQL server or MS Access or any other database, the logic and code that we will cover in this session will remain the same. All you really have to do is change the connection string, which you can easily find on this website. Okay, let's select Excel. Now, you have a lot of options here to select from. We will find our relevant one. Our macro file will either be a .xlsm or .xlsp file. And we can just search for the connection string that's related to that. My file is a .xlsp. So I'm going to use this particular connection string. Select all of this, copy, and let's head back over to our code. Now this function requires the connection string to be entered as a text. So we'll paste the connection string inside two double quotes. Control V. Now we need to modify this slightly. First of all, you can see that there's already a double quote inside the connection string that we got from the website. Now Excel will not accept this because it will think that we're ending the string. In order to avoid any error, we need to add another double quote. One here and another here. We will also need to modify the file name or the data source, which is this right here, and point it to our current file. We can use the full name property of the workbook object to get the name of our current file. Let's do that. First, we'll delete this, exit out of the string, two double quotes, get two ampersands in there as well. And inside the ampersand, we'll go this workbook dot the full name property. If your data is in a separate file, you could add the full file path instead. Now that the connection is open, we can fire off our SQL query. But we would need to extract the results of our query into something. For this, we need to first define a record set, which is a sort of a virtual table held in memory. So here's the plan. We extract the results of the SQL query into the record set, and then we dump the data from the record set into our worksheet. Now record set is an object. So in order to use it, we will need to create a new instance of it. Let's do that. Let's first dim a record set, call it RS, use the ADODB library and choose record set. And now let's create a new instance of it. Now we will define our SQL query and store it inside a string variable. Let's dim the variable first. And let's assign a value to it. I'll just leave this blank for now. Okay, now let's quickly construct our query. For those of you who are unfamiliar with SQL, please refer to the next section where we'll progressively build this query. Okay, first we will state the columns or the fields that we need to group by. So select, we'll choose the invoice number, invoice date, and customer. Next, we will add the fields that we want to sum. So we'll sum the invoice amount, sum the tax column, and sum the gross amount column. Now, we need to specify where we need to get this data from. The expectation here is to provide the worksheet name. We don't need to provide the workbook name since we have already done that in the connection string right here. So let's move on to the next line by putting in an ampersand and an underscore. We will say from square brackets, the data is on the invoice detail worksheet. And to reference the worksheet, we also need to add a $sign at the end of it. Don't forget a space here. Let's go to the next line. And finally, we will add our group by clause. So we are going to group by the invoice number, invoice date, and the customer. Now we'll open the record set and feed the results from our query into it. Let's open the record set. We need to provide a source, which will be our query right here. And we need to provide the connection details, which is just a con variable right here. And we won't worry about the other parameters in this video. Okay, getting there. If everything has gone well till now, our query would have provided the results we need and stored it in the record set. So let's dump these results into our invoice header worksheet. But before we do that, let's clear the contents of the destination worksheet. So we can just use the code name of the worksheet directly. We just say cells and clear contents. And we'll paste the data in range A1. And to copy over the data from the record set, we have a dedicated method of the range object. It's called copy from record set. So let's choose that. It's this right here. And what do you want to copy? We can copy the record set directly. Just RS. Let's rearrange the column bits as well. That should do it. So let's close the record set and close the connection. Finally, we can release the record set and the connection objects by setting them to nothing. This step is not really necessary because Excel will do it for you when you exit the sub, but it's considered good practice and we'll add it to our code here. So set RS is equal to nothing and set the connection is equal to nothing as well. Just as a recap, we have our data right here in the invoice detail worksheet, and we're going to aggregate or group it and paste it into our invoice header worksheet, which is currently blank. Okay, let's run this code. I'm getting a syntax error out here. I can see we've missed a comma. So let's end this and add a comma right here and run this again. Cool. We've got some results which look correct, but it seems like we're missing headers. Let's fix that. Go back to our code. Now, data and headers are stored separately in a record set. If you want to include the header information, we need to mention it separately as well. For a record set, a header or a column name is actually referred to as a field. But we can't just paste these fields in one go like we did for the data. Rather, we need to loop through all the fields and paste them as we go. Let's declare a counter variable. Let's do the loop now. The field's index starts from 0. So we will go from 0 to count. Close the loop. And every cell in the first row will be equal to the corresponding field name. So the row will be 1 and we'll iterate through each column. And that's the loop. And we'll now paste the record set in A2, which is in the second row. Okay, looks good. Let's run this and see what we get. Let's head on over to our sheet. Great. We can see the headers populate in the first row and the data in the second row onwards. So that was how to create the basic query, which is pretty much the bulk of the code. I think we went through quite a few steps there. So before we continue, let's recap what we just did. The very first thing we do is add a reference to the ADO library. Using that, we create a new connection. And then we open that connection using a connection string for Excel. Similarly, we create a new record set which is going to hold the results of the query. Now we define the query. You could actually do this at any step prior. Then we go ahead and open the record set using the query and the connection. The query results would have been saved into a record set. We can now go ahead and dump it into our Excel sheet. Remember, we need to paste the headers and the data separately. Now let's close the record set and let's close the connection and finally release the objects. What is missing is some error handling. But before we look at that, let's deconstruct the SQL Group By statement that we created in this section. If you're new to SQL, be sure to check it out. If you're fairly confident about it, you could skip directly to the error handling section. Hey, just before we move on, I want to quickly add one tip. I could have mentioned this in the coding section, but I don't want to break the flow. So right here, when we open the connection, we may want to first test if it actually works. Instead of moving on to setting the record set, we could just first close the connection and run the code. So just remove this out, remove this as well. If the code runs without any errors now, that means the connection was successfully opened and closed, so we don't have to worry about this. But if there is an error, we would need to address it first. So no point moving on with the code if you can't set up the connection at all. Most likely issue would be an incorrect connection string. For example, change this to an 11. Let's run this and we have an error. So this means that the connection string that we had chosen was wrong. We would most likely need to head back to the connection strings website and choose a more suitable option. Okay, moving on. On the face of it, basic SQL is super easy to pick up even without any prior knowledge. Let's first copy over our previous code. We'll just change the subname and we can just blank out the SQL statement. The most basic SQL query would involve a select statement and a from statement. In the select, you specify what fields you want to see, and in the from, you specify where the data is going to come from. So where is our data? We will refer to the same data as in the previous section. So this is what we have out here. To start with, let's just select the invoice numbers from column A. So let's start with select and we mention the column name. And we'll just place the from statement on a different line. To break to another line, let's go ampersand and underscore. Don't forget to add a space. We could add a space out here before the from or at the end of the upper statement, doesn't really matter. And from where the data is stored in our invoice detail worksheet. So we put the worksheet name inside 2 square brackets. And when referring to a worksheet, we need to put a $sign at the end of the worksheet name. And let's close the double quotes. So let's run this. We will see the output of the results in our invoice header worksheet. So all this data is going to clear out and we would expect just all the invoice numbers to be displayed in column A. Okay, let's run this. Come back here. Great. We've got a result, but the invoice numbers seem to be repeating. And that's actually correct. That's because there are multiple rows with the same invoice number relating to each product line in that invoice. So we can see the invoice numbers repeating out here and our output has 49 rows as well. Awesome. If you want to just see the unique invoice numbers in this data set, you can use the group by clause. We could also use a distinct statement instead of the group by, but for this video, we'll just stick to group by to keep things simple. Let's add a third line where we specify the field that we want the grouping to be done on, which is the invoice number field. So let's break onto a new line. Double quotes again, a space, and we'll write our group by statement. Let's run this. Great. Now we have a unique set of invoice numbers. Just like dictionaries or pivot tables, you can use this group by technique to find unique values in any data set. But what if you also want to see the total gross amount per invoice? So basically we would just want to see one line for the invoice and a total of the gross amount against it. We can achieve that using a sum function. So let's go sum, and the column name we want to perform the summing on. Let's run this. The data looks correct, but the column name is looking a bit random. For calculated columns, we need to assign a column name in the SQL statement. So let's do that. We'll just call this calculated column as gross amount. Great. This looks much better. Now, let's go one step further. So far what we have done can easily be achieved using a dictionary object. But where the SQL method shines is when we want to start grouping or summing on more than one column. And adding more columns is just super easy. So let's group this data by invoice number, invoice date, customer, and we'll again sum the gross amount for that combination of data. So all we'll do is just add the invoice date, customer, and that's it. Let's run this. Okay, so that didn't work. Let's see what the error message says. It says that the invoice date is not a part of the aggregate function, which is correct. Let's end this. That means that every column that we're aggregating or grouping needs to be included in the group by statement as well. So far, we just had the invoice number, but we need to include the invoice date and customer as well. And we do not need to include the calculated column out here. So let's run this again. Okay, easy. I just want to add that for this to work, the same invoice number should have the same invoice date and the same customer. If one invoice number has multiple customers, you will get multiple results here for each combination of invoice number and customer. If that's not what you want, you would need to exclude customers while grouping. Okay, almost there. We're just summing here by gross amount, but we can sum other numeric columns as well. So let's sum the invoice amount and tax columns as well. So that's the invoice amount and the tax column. Okay, that's all that was needed. Let's run this. Come back to our results, and now we can see the sums of the invoice amount and the tax column as well. Okay, perfect. We have constructed the entire group by clause from scratch. Before we move on, let's look at some variations. We don't need to restrict ourselves to summing. Based on the scenario, we can perform other operations such as counts and averages. Example, suppose we want to count the number of lines per invoice. Let's try that out. So let's delete this and we'll use the count function. Before I write the rest of the statement, I just want to quickly mention that SQL is case insensitive. So it doesn't matter if you write this in uppercase, camel case, or lowercase. Best practice would be to use uppercase, but it really doesn't matter. So let's continue with our code. So we want to count the number of rows or lines per invoice number, and we'll call this as count of lines, and let's just keep invoice number in the group by statement. Okay, let's run this. Great, we can see the count. Suppose we want to see totals and counts, we can do that as well. So let's sum the gross amount and count the number of lines in the same statement. Okay, let's run this. Awesome. We also don't need to perform our operations on the entire data set. Example, we can choose to group data for a particular customer using the where clause. So let's say we want to group the invoice numbers belonging to the customer mighty big part. We will need to add our new where statement just after the from statement. So we will say where the customer like single quotes, and starting with mighty, we can add a percentage sign at the end. Just to easily verify our results, we'll just add the customer in the group by statement and the select statement as well. Okay, let's run this. Great. We can see just the invoices related to mighty big part customer. These don't need to be hard coded. We can use a variable instead of mighty and make the query dynamic, but let's leave that for another video. And lastly, we can even sort the results. Suppose we want to sort by customer, and then within customer, we want the invoices to be arranged from newest to oldest. Let's do that. Let's remove this where statement. We'll add the invoice date column first. Add it to the group by statement as well. Let's break to another line. The keyword for sorting is order by. So we'll first sort by the customer. The default sort method is ascending and we do not need to specify that. Next, let's sort by invoice date. But this time we want from newest to oldest, which is a descending order, and we do need to specify that. Okay, let's run this. And there we have it. We can see the invoice number is sorted by customer and then by invoice date and from the newest to the oldest. Great. Now let's move on to the next section where we look at some error handling. In this section, we will go over some error handling that we can use to gracefully exit our sub procedure if something goes wrong. Our concern is that if something goes wrong, our record set or the connection will remain open. So our error handling should focus on closing these off whenever an error is detected. So let's copy over the code from section 1. Change the subname. So we'll place the trigger for our error handler at the very beginning of our code. We'll just say go to the error handler line. But we haven't defined this error handler line yet. So let's do that. Come at the very bottom and we'll add this reference. So if there's an error, we would like to print the error in the immediate window. And then we'll go to the clean exit line and gracefully exit our sub. We haven't created the clean exit line yet. We'll print out the error number. Add in a couple of line breaks. And print out the description. And after we do that, let's move on to the clean exit, which we haven't created yet. We'll add the clean exit reference after we've finished pasting our results. Okay, so there's the possibility that the code could fail even before we initiate the record set object. That is, if there was something wrong with the connection string itself. In this case, there is no record set to close and there is no record set to set to nothing. So we need to shape our exit code to cater to that. So first, we will check if the record set is not nothing. That means that the record set was initiated. So if it's not nothing, then we would like to set it to nothing before we exit out of the sub. And we'll also check if the record set was actually opened at any point. So to check if a record set is open, we need to check what the state of the record set is. The constant for open is 1. So if it is open, then we will close it. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the connection. So actually we don't need any of this part. I'm going to delete this. Just copy the record set part, paste it down. And let's just replace the RS with con. Just go Control F, search for RS, replace with con. Make sure the selected text is selected, otherwise you'll replace it across the entire sub. Click replace all. Okay. Close. And that's it. And finally, most importantly, don't forget to exit the sub, because if you don't, then this resume clean exit will get triggered. And then this entire procedure will fall into an infinite loop, and we definitely want to avoid that. Cool. Let's just run this and see if everything's working fine as is. Okay, so the procedure ran through correctly, so there are no bugs as such. Let's put some deliberate failures out here. Let's mess this connection string up a bit. Just gonna delete this part. That means the connection string is obviously wrong. Put a couple of breakpoints at our error handlers just to see how the code performs. Let's run this. And our error handler picks it up immediately. Let's print out the error. Pre706, it says provider wasn't found, which is obviously correct. Okay, now it's going to move on to the clean exit part. Let's F8 onto that. The record set wasn't initiated, so this entire part would be ignored, which is correct. The connection was initiated, so this statement is true, but we weren't able to open the connection, so this part will get ignored. And the connection will be set to nothing. Awesome. Okay, and we exit out the sub. Cool. Let's just delete this part out, restore it back to the original 12. Okay, so let's put another deliberate error. We will delete out the space before the from. So the SQL statement will read this entire gross amount and from as one word, and that's incorrect, and it should throw an error. Let's place our breakpoints again, run the sub. We had an error. Let's see what it says. Something wrong with the select statement, which is correct. There is something wrong with the statement. Move on to the clean exit. The record set was initiated, so this statement is true, but we did not open the record set because the SQL statement wasn't recognized, so this part will be ignored. Set the record set to nothing. Move to the next statement. The connection was initiated, so yes, this is correct. The connection was open as well, so this will be true. Now we get to close the connection and we get to set the connection to nothing. Great. Finally, exit this up. Awesome. Great. Let's move on to the last part where we learn how to copy contents into an array instead of pasting them directly into a worksheet. Okay, so sometimes pasting the raw results into the worksheet may not be ideal, especially if you want to modify the data further using code. You may prefer to do the modifications in an array. For this reason, it may be beneficial to directly paste the SQL query results into an array. Let's see how to do that. In fact, what we will do is instead of copying from the record set, we will extract the results into an array and then paste it onto a worksheet. So our output will still remain the same as the demo version. Let's create a new module. Let's copy the code from the previous section. We'll need to make a few changes to just one part of the code. Come right here to just above the copy from record set part. We will need to define two arrays. I'll explain why soon. First, let's dim the arrays as variants. Now, instead of the copy from record set method, we will use the getRows method to extract the results from the record set and paste it directly into our first array. Let's comment this out. So we'll go. There's a first array equals to the record set and the getRows method. Now we could try and paste this array as is onto our output sheet, except that it won't work the way we want it to. To understand why, we need to inspect the elements of the array in the locals window. So let's do that. Let's just first make our locals window visible. It's right out here. Let's put a breakpoint just after we populate the array. Okay, let's run this code. We got an error. I don't think I fixed the code from the previous error handling section. We need to add in a space out here. Cool. Just remove this. Run the code again. Awesome. So here's our array that's been populated. Let's inspect the first row. So this looks a bit weird. The first row is filled with invoice numbers instead of details of the first invoice. What's happened is that the results were transposed. That is, rows instead of columns and columns instead of rows. So that's a bit inconvenient. We will need to transpose it back. That's why we need a second array, that is, to hold the transposed results from the previous array. So let's stop this, come back down. So let's first resize our second array. The rows will be the same as the number of columns in the first array plus 1, and the same thing for columns. So the array will go from 1 to the upper bound of the columns in the first array plus 1, and for columns we'll go from 1 to the upper bound of the rows in the first array. Okay, so now let's populate our second array using the transpose function. So we'll use application.transpose. And what are we transposing? We're transposing the first array. Great. Now we can paste these results onto our sheet. We need to define the full range of the results onto the worksheet before we paste the data. So we'll paste it onto the invoice header worksheet, which we can refer to directly using the worksheet code name. So we'll paste it beginning from the second row and the first column, right down to the upper bound of the second array plus 1. Dot value is equal to the second array. If you're unfamiliar with this technique of copying and pasting using arrays, let me know in the comments below and I can make a useful code series video on it. Okay, that's it. Let's run this code and see if we get the same result. Head on to our invoice header worksheet. Okay, so this is the exact same result as a demo 1, and that was the intention. But instead of copying the results directly from the record set, we dumped the results into an array and dumped the array onto our worksheet. Okay, fantastic. And that's it for the coding part. And that's the video. As promised at the start, this was not just a video about Group By. We managed to cram in a healthy dose of ADO and SQL as well. All the code for this video will be available on our website. Link is in the description below. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. If it has added some value, please do consider subscribing. Great. Thanks and see you in the next video.